Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson and Robert Schut. Today we'll be covering the 10th installment of Soren Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments. To start things off, Bob has some background information on the Hegelian dialectic for us.
Well, last time we left off that we were discussing the synthesis idea, and I wasn't completely clear what Kierkegaard was getting at. And before I tried to give examples and kind of teach it, I figured, hey, I better understand it myself first. So maybe I missed something. So I went back over the book, and I kind of took some of the verses that he did, some of the text that he did, and then tried to understand each line by line. So I kind of, that's where I am with my notes anyway. So he says here about the synthesis, he says, is not necessity then the synthesis of possibility and actuality? So that's what he was trying to synthesize. I was a little unclear on that. It's trying to say, what if we look at possibility and actuality? Will it synthesize into necessity? And that's the question that I came up with. Does possibility and actuality synthesize into necessity? So now we've kind of focused on exactly what he's trying to tell us here. And then he says possibility and actuality do not differ in essence, but they differ in being. And the difference in being is one does not exist. One is in possibility, and the other is actual. So we have what he calls, and he'll call this the contradiction. That he's going to try to resolve. So let's just say here, let's call the possibility of a thing a thesis. Okay, so we'll say this is our thesis, a thing is possible. And let's call the actuality of a thing its antithesis or its antithesis.
Sure.
Can we theorize that somehow we can reconcile the two between the thesis and the antithesis and become, let's say, a synthesis? And what would we call this synthesis? Let's call it necessity. So, whether you want to take that as Hegelian or not, that's up to you. But that's how I'm kind of seeing what he's trying to put together for us here. The synthesis, the antithesis, the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.
Yeah.
Okay. Whoever developed it, we talked about that last week. We don't really care about that. Then he says, how could there from this difference be formed the synthesis constituting necessity, which is not a determination of being, but a determination of essence?
Right.
Since it is the essence of the necessary to be. So what he's trying to do is take us and give us a little definition here of essence. And saying of necessity, rather, saying that necessity is something that is still it's an essence of something. It's the essence to be. It's something eternal. It doesn't come into being. So it's an essence. And it says, in the case of the necessary, its very essence is to exist. It's in a class of all its own, he tells us. So it doesn't come into existence. It simply exists as part of its essence. But non-being and being do not synthesize into necessity, for one will cancel out the other, which is what we talked about. You have possibility or you have existence. When you exist, it's no longer possible because it's existing. And if it's possible, it hasn't yet existed. So they don't synthesize into necessity, but they join in some kind of a strange paradox where necessity is a quality of essence. Oh, let's see what else we can say about it. So something doesn't become necessary through synthesis or for any other process for that matter. Now, one of the things that we want to be, that I have to always be careful of doing here is turning Climacus into Kierkegaard. And Climacus has kind of walked on the edge of a line where he hasn't quite referred to the teacher as Christ. I mean, he's led us right up to that point, but he's not saying that the teacher is Christ. And he's not talking about God as the Christian God, but as the God of Socrates. So he's giving us the foundational principles upon which he's going to later lay this idea. So sometimes I go a little bit over the edge, and I kind of see this. So
I don't think it's just you. I think maybe I have pushed you in that direction because I know where it's all going, and I'm just like, he means Jesus.
Yeah, so we kind of do that, but just so that the audience knows, we're kind of, extrapolating that into that he's talking about the Christ.
We're sort of spoiling it a little bit.
Yeah. So I can leave it right there for now without going in and trying to say, okay, how does this actually relate to God? Which is probably the safest thing to do right now. So anyway, is there any question on that? Now, does that clearly give us what he's trying to say, why the synthesis does not work here?
Right. I mean, I think we probably would have some Hegelians who are listening and be like, oh, no, it can work. And I'm sure there's a lot of Hegelian work done on this idea of how possibility and actuality can be unified into necessity or something like that. But we're kind of, we end up grasping at straws. We're looking at Kierkegaard's interpretation of Hegel rather than Hegel himself. And maybe for another day, maybe we'll do, maybe we can do some shorter Hegelian work like the philosophy of history, or I don't know, maybe we'll do the phenomenology of spirit one day and we'll get a better understanding of how these things work. It's one of the problems with working in Kierkegaard is how faithful an interpreter, how generous is he to Hegel. There are probably a lot of Hegelians who would think that he is fundamentally incomplete in his interpretation of Hegel. So,
But what's important to do right now for us is to clearly present Kierkegaard. A lot of times when I notice that people who argue something, they will get to a point and then they'll start the argument a little too early because Kierkegaard hasn't completed his point yet. So don't stop him right now and try to argue it. Let's just listen to his full argument, see what he's trying to build, his foundation, and where he's taking us. Then we can go back and argue whether or not he, represented this synthesis correctly or not.
And when you say someone, you mean me.
Oh, no, I don't. Because I think we all want to jump into the argument, right? We all want to do that. We all want to say, oh, wait a second, let's listen to that. But we got to sometimes be a little more patient with Kierkegaard. I try to be patient with all philosophers when they do. I say, well, it's a little too early. Let me see where he's taking me first before I jump in and start saying he's wrong. So Hegelians out there, just be patient. Listen to Kierkegaard a little bit longer before you jump into the argument. Right,
and it's not just the Hegelians that get impatient. I think Kierkegaardians because you have the tendency to agree so much with people with Kierkegaard. You're just like yeah. Let's get to the good stuff. Right? It's like. It's like when you're talking to a friend who's of the same political persuasion as you. You don't have to justify your presuppositions. You're like, right? Like it's travesty, right? And they're like, totally. But then if you encounter someone who totally disagrees with you, then you have to go back and set the whole thing up. And
right, you're right, yeah.
Then hate each other and never speak to one another again.
Yeah.
So, all right. Do you want me to do my little song and dance?
Yeah, it is your turn now, and I'm all ears. I'm going to sit here and just listen and I'll jump in with some arguments when I can. How's that sound?
I want you to jump in here and there because when I took these notes, I don't think I had the same sort of clarity that we do now about possibility, actuality, necessity, contingency, the historical. I mean, I'll do my best here, but feel free to jump in.
Okay.
So, we're finally on section 4 of chapter 4. It's called The Apprehension of the Past. And Kierkegaard says, via the pseudonym of Johann Climacus, that nature in its immediate existence is only a spatial order. All right. So that there really is only the present moment. This is the only thing that we can have an immediate sense data or impression of, that there really is no future. There really is no past. But we tend to think of the present as something that can persist into the past, or that the historical is the past, which seems so certain and dependable. Now, why have I used the word "seem certain"? I think everything that Bob and I have talked about when we talk about coming into the historical coming into existence, we know that something that is necessary can't come into existence, and anything that comes into existence has to be sort of this annihilation of possibility that we have to look back on and do our best to apprehend. And the very nature of the ambiguity of interpreting the past prevents it from being certain knowledge, just like trying to forecast into the future and apprehend what's going to happen in the future. We don't really have certain knowledge or foreknowledge, but we can talk a little bit more about that. But I mean, the biggest thing is, I think the thing that Kierkegaard's trying to say is that the historical has this sort of illusion of certainty, eternity, necessity, because the further that we get out from it, the more like it seems like, well, it just had to happen, that there was like this unfolding that just had to be, that God's will was sort of marching out into existence. And he thinks that's a little bit of an illusion, not too different from like maybe looking at a square tower and going further and further away from it, so it starts to appear round to our eyes. The fact of the matter is that the historical being necessary is an outright contradiction. You can never have something come into being and be necessary, because that would involve change and the annihilation of the antecedent state of possibility that we've talked so much about. Now, I think that's generally what he's saying here. I didn't think that was a big deal. Do you kind of think so far so good, Bob, on what I'm saying here?
Yeah, I would just add the uncertainty factor comes in because of the senses, because I think that's what he's going to develop right later on, right, about how the senses actually don't deceive us, which is kind of
it's an interesting.
It goes kind of against the way we would normally think of it, which I'll let you take care of. But yeah, we're getting into the idea that we only sense the present. We don't sense the past or the future. Our senses, just like our seeing and our hearing, we can't hear things that happen. So that's all I would add on that.
Yeah, totally. So our knowledge or foreknowledge of the past and the future does not confer any sort of necessity upon that is to happen or that which has happened. Our apprehension can't give the quality of necessity to anything. And therefore, the past and the future are really based upon uncertainty, despite what we think our history books or whatever else has been told to us. And he says this, I think the sentiment is captured well in this paragraph that I'm going to recite right here from Philosophical Fragments. Whoever apprehends the past, historico philosophus, is therefore a prophet in retrospect. I love that. Mm-hmm. That he is a prophet expresses the fact that the certainty of the past is based upon an uncertainty that exists for the past in precisely the same sense that it exists for the future, being rooted in the possibility, Leibniz, in the possible worlds, out of which it could not emerge with necessity. So he thinks like the true historian is going to wonder at the uncertainty coming into existence. Now, what do you think about that? I get this, I understand this idea of the historical not being necessary. But what do you think about the historical or coming into existence being uncertain? I think I know what he means by that, but what do you think he means by that? I hope I'm not putting you on the spot too much, but like we have all these words that Kierkegaard throws around, and I thought maybe it might be good just to slow down and examine what he means by uncertainty.
Yeah, the uncertainty, there's a gap in what we can know, and we can't know that something actually came into existence. Though we kind of assume, or as he'll get into a little bit more, it's fate that gets us past this point of uncertainty. But there's always the uncertainty in history because we just can't. We're not contemporary with it. We're not. It doesn't come to our senses.
Right, because we don't have a sense for the historical. We just have a sense for an event, but we kind of construct the narrative after the fact, right?
Yeah, he calls it the organ. He uses that term. Yeah. We don't have an organ by which we can perceive the past or really perceive the future. The organs we have to perceive the present are our eyes, our ears and our touch. So yeah, we are built to understand with as much certainty as we can the present. But when we leave the present in either direction, we enter into that era of uncertainty.
Right. And we can kind of, maybe we should illustrate this a little bit. He has this, he has this passage about the star. And maybe we can make it more contemporary. But he says, thus, when the observer sees a star, the star becomes involved in doubt the moment he seeks to become aware of its having come into existence. It is as if reflection took the star away from the senses. So presumably, like, prehistoric man saw the star the same way that we saw the star, right? Mm-hmm. But we have a certain narrative that how that star came into existence. And the prehistoric man probably had a certain narrative for how that star came into existence. And maybe men 3,000 years from now, will have another narrative for how that star comes into existence. And you can see how, like, our paradigms begin to break down. We tend to not trust them, or maybe we ought to be skeptical. I think, maybe this point is probably illustrated a little bit more with like history. There are a lot of ways to tell the founding of America, right? You can tell, you can say, well, America was founded, and you can wrap it up in the flag and liberty and all this stuff and talk about individual actualization and freedom and liberty and all this stuff. And someone else can tell the story about oppression and enslavement and systematic oppression. And which narrative do you want to believe, right? Which one is true? Right. And this, right, this kind of illustrates like a big divide that we have in our country. It's like we have on nearly any quote unquote fact. I don't know if you can hear the air quotes in my voice if you're listening to the audio. Sort of like the political divide in this country, any fact that we could point to, we can't have like a mature conversation about it, because people are willing to believe, and this will get into this idea, different narratives about that fact. I'm trying to think of a non-explosive example that we could use here, Bob. Do you want to do this?
Oh, well, I just thought came into mind of who discovered America. Some people say it was Columbus. Other people say it was Leif Erikson, was it?
Yeah.
And other people say it was never discovered because there were people already here. So
right. It was discovered by it was discovered by the people that came over on the land bridge. What makes it discovered by the Vikings or Columbus? Why does that? What, just because they put a flag down?
Right. Yeah. So different narratives.
Which I might be okay with that view, because I think it would mean that we own the moon. I wouldn't be. Yeah. And if we get to Mars and we put a flag there, we might own Mars. But that's a digression. Anywho, he says. It's interesting if we use historical examples far enough in the past to become less politically controversial. Good choice, Bob. Lord knows that's a grenade if I mention anything that happened in, I don't know, past 15 years.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. Anywho, so he talks that we have to have this an organ for discerning the historical, and it's got to have a structure analogous with the historical itself. And what does that mean? Essentially, it's got to negate with certainty the uncertainty of coming into existence. So we've talked about this twofold uncertainty: is the non-being of the antecedent and the annihilation of the possible. So what is this thing that can give us this narrative? And he's going to say faith has the quality for certainty of belief. And this is not going to be faith like in the imminent sense, in the greatest culminating sense of faith, which we'll see is going to be the Christian faith for Kierkegaard. This is faith in the ordinary sense. This is going to be just sort of like faith that, like, that the laws of gravitation are true, and that, like, if I sit down in my chair, someone's not going to pull it out from beneath me, or faith in sort of evolution or the second law of thermodynamics. this kind of faith, these things that we sort of assume and take for granted. And it's a faith that believes in the unseen. And, we may not, except for maybe the most skeptical people, Kierkegaard will say that skeptics, they don't really rely on arguments to validate their knowledge or validate their skeptical position, because then that in some way would be recognizing an enduring virtue of philosophical argumentation. And skeptics, by the very nature, are dubious of all knowledge. But that skepticism is just a total restraint against belief or having faith in anything. And going back to our star analogy, or any event, we have to will to believe that a certain event has come into existence. And doubt and uncertainty can only be overcome via an act of will. And we have to will to believe certain conclusions and inferences. And that's precisely where errors can occur. Thus, belief is not a form of knowledge, but a free act of will. Now, I thought that was huge.
That was a big one.
This is totally huge. So to believe that something comes into existence or to overcome the antecedent non-being, you have to will to believe and annul the possible how. Right? So what this is going to mean for Kierkegaard is that like doubt and belief are going to be like on opposite poles from one another, and neither one of them are knowledge. Right. So the will to believe is just this conclusion, this resolution that excludes doubt. He says the moment faith believes that its fact has come into existence, has happened, it makes the event and the fact doubtful in the process of becoming, and makes it thus also doubtful through its relation to the possible how of the coming into existence. And Johann Climacus will say the only thing, and we've talked about this already, the only thing that's not dubious is our immediate impressions, and we cannot have immediate impressions for this coming into existence. What do I want to say here as I kind of wrap up my section? Do you want to say anything before I kind of move on to the next part?
Yeah, let me just mention what you said there. It sounds like for me, when I read this, he's creating a kind of a tension between faith or belief or certainty and uncertainty or doubt. The idea here is creating this tension, dynamic, antagonism, polarization, whatever you want to call it, where we have both. Where we have doubt, we want to fill it in, we fill it in with faith. Where we have faith, doubt tries to come in and take faith away. So we have this tension, and we're in the middle between these two tensions. He also mentions here, did you want to talk a little bit more about the Greek skeptic and why the senses, I thought it was interesting, why the senses don't deceive us?
I kind of said everything that I was going to say about Greek skepticism, but why don't you say more? Because I think it sounds like you might have some more notes on it.
Oh, well, I'm not sure. Maybe you just said it quickly and I missed it. But it was interesting that he talks about the Greek skeptic didn't think that it's actually the senses that deceive us. It's not what we see. Like even if we see a mirage, it's not that the eyes are deceived and the senses are deceived. It's our conclusions that we make of that our senses bring to us. So, totally. So like if you see the stick in the glass of water and it appears bent, it's a conclusion on your part that the stick is bent, whereas the eyes don't make that conclusion. And that was the intermediate phase that he brings us through, is to make the conclusion. He says, therefore, it's a decision on your part to believe or not believe in something.
Yeah.
Okay. So I just wanted to fill that, maybe slow that down a little bit to make sure that
I have a tendency to get a little motor mouth. I don't know how I'll ever.
No, you get excited. It's excitement. I could sense it, which is great. And that's part of it.
Well, you know what I found is something I've enjoyed. I do these poetry recitations. I'm trying to learn how to get good at it, and that whole micro machines spokesperson talk does not work for that. And so maybe poetry will eventually give me a better lecturing voice. But I think that's probably the biggest critique about how I teach. I tend to just sprint through it all.
Well, that's probably why we make a good combination, because people probably listen to me and say, "Come on, Bob, make your point, get on to it." And so between you and me, we just kind of have that dynamic. Between you and me, we have a decent person or something.
Yeah, we got a synthesis.
Right.
Right. I you can be the thesis. I'll be the antithesis. And,
okay.
What we make here is the synthesis. Hegel jokes. Who's got them? I do. Okay, so I just to tie up the section that I had prepared for today. What's interesting about this is that those of us who are not contemporary with a historical event, like the teacher that is sent from without, who's different from the Socratic teacher. This is Jesus again. We have the testimony of contemporaries to tell us about the immediacy, and we kind of stand in relation to that testimony as the contemporaries stood in relation to the immediacy, to being right there with the teacher. So I have this, it seems like that testimony becomes our immediacy. They were beholding Jesus, Son of God, or whatever, but we have their words to kind of put ourselves in a similar sort of situation where we can use, I don't know, it seems like our imagination to come as if we were already there. And maybe that's, why movies and having the word read aloud to us and all that stuff, maybe that's why it's good, because it can kind of give us that experience that the contemporaries who interacted with Jesus had. But we can also see that doesn't really, it proves kind of his earlier point that doesn't mean that we automatically will to believe in this teacher. And that's going to have to be, regardless if you existed, I guess at the time of this, 1843 years prior to the writing of this, or 2000 years prior to this, or whatever else, it doesn't really help you for the uncertainty. The how will be the same for him as the contemporary. And this testimony will not resolve the suspense. So presumably the successor, us, will have to will to believe as well. And that's going to, we'll have to will to believe, not in the ordinary sense, but presumably we'll have to will to believe in the imminent sense. Is that kind of what you got from this section, Bob?
Yeah, I did. And I'm not sure that I took it a little bit further or not, because in my notes here, I sometimes get a little blended with what he says and what I think he's saying. But so let me say what I want to say here, and then you tell me whether this is how this sounds to you. The successor, which is us, when we're looking backwards into history, the listener or the reader, the successor believes the past not because of existence, but because of essence. It's the essence that maintains from the present to the past. So Kierkegaard here, at least for me, is refocusing my attention not so much into the actual existence, but into the essence as being the part that maintains itself from the past to the present, and may even extend out into the future. This is why it's not simply just believing anything we want to believe. Otherwise, we'd throw out the whole factor of essence. So it's not like, well, if somebody says I'm God, well, now we got to believe him because he said he's God, because we have to exercise faith. It's not faith alone here. It's faith in the essence of the individual. So if he's going to say he's God, then he must somehow show us he has the essence of God.
Well, and I don't think that can be shown by the testimony of the contemporaries. That's going to be shown in that Augenblick, in the moment.
Yes,
right?
yes. That's the revelation. That's the revelation. That's the what did he call it again? The moment that changes everything. Yeah. So, So anyway, that's what I've got for today.
Do you want to go a little bit further, or do we have a little bit of a shorter broadcast today? I'm done with everything I wanted to cover.
Okay, maybe we should just leave it a short broadcast for today, so we don't give too much away here.
I know we're kind of hard on ourselves since we usually go for like an hour and a half each time, but maybe it's okay to have one that's like 40 minutes long.
Well, this is a weekend broadcast here, so
yeah, special edition.
Special edition, right? So
live from the meat locker in Percival, Virginia.
yeah.
All right, buddy. Well, let's bring it to a close here, and you and I'll talk about where we go next. Okay.
Okay. Terrific. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you for listening, everybody. Go download the Noetic app and join the party. All right. Bye.